We begin tonight with the war in Ukraine. President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, have been meeting President Putin in Moscow today to present him with an amended plan to end the war in Ukraine. The terms, originally based on Moscow's demands, have been revised after multiple rounds of talks with Ukrainian negotiators. Hours earlier, the Kremlin said Russia had fully captured the key Donbass town of Petrovsk after more than a year of heavy fighting and casualties. Russia's defense ministry posted a video purportedly showing its troops raising a flag over Prokof's central square. But Ukraine's military has contradicted that claim, saying that the fighting continues.
Конфликт будет урегулирован. Это не в ближайшее время, так точно.
Почему?
Ну, потому что у Путина свои условно какие-то позиции определенные, а у Украины Зеленский, то есть их не готов соблюдать, скажем так.
Я считаю, пока невозможно, потому что не выполнены никакие условия договора о том, о чем раньше Путин говорил.
Наши условия – это ни в коем случае, чтобы Украина не входила в НАТО. А этому препятствует НАТО само, непосредственно, Европа. Вся за это, понимаете?
Well, for more on developments out of Russia and Ukraine, I'm joined now on the line from London by the author and international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Thank you ever so much, Dr. Laskiewicz, for joining us. So diplomatic efforts to end the war between Russia and Ukraine are gathering pace once again. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner in Moscow to discuss the latest draft of that US brokered peace plan with Vladimir Putin. What are your thoughts about that? Is Mr. Putin likely to go along with it? Is he likely to disappoint President Trump again, or does it depend on what's actually in that peace plan?
Well, it does depend what's in that peace plan. And it also, I think, will be a case not so much of rejecting outright, since it is based on his original points, but rather that some points will be contentious. And it's this that there will be talk of. The clear one that appears to be contentious is that the business of territory, who occupies what territory, is apparently to be left to a later date, with a ceasefire line being drawn where it is. And that, of course, won't please President Putin, because the implication will be that since Ukraine will never agree to this, he will simply be a de facto controller of part of Ukraine or not de jure. So I imagine that what President Putin will say is that he accepts, say, half or two-thirds or whatever of the plan, but certain points still need to be resolved, which is his way of saying he basically wants the Ukrainian territory legally recognized by America and Ukraine.
Well, let's just stick with that issue of territorial concessions, because that is clearly, as you pointed out, one of the sticking points, which is not only hugely unpopular with the Ukrainian people, but also, according to them, almost impossible from a legal point of view, because as they claim, Ukraine needs to change its constitution in order to change its territory, but it is prohibited from doing so during martial law. It sounds almost like it's a no-go area, but given that about 20% of Ukraine is already under Russian control, would it simply be Ukraine acknowledging the reality on the ground?
Well, there are two aspects here. The first, as you rightly state, there is the problem that the Ukrainian constitution prevents this. However, that is a short-term difficulty, because were martial law to be lifted tomorrow, and in principle it could be, there's no obvious reason why martial law has to be there, then as a result, the constitution is changeable. And constitutions have changed. There's nothing impossible about changing constitutions. I mean, the American Constitution might be changed to permit President Donald Trump a third term. The question is how to go about it legally. And the idea that Ukraine is one and indivisible, in any case, comes from the 1905 Russian Constitution, which so proclaimed that about Russia. And that has long since gone. And likewise, the Ukrainian Constitution, for all that it prevents or doesn't prevent, could be changed. But it is unlikely to have a very simple reason. There is a war on, hence the martial law. The president and his supporters don't want it changed. So therefore, there's another reason. And therefore, this is unlikely, therefore, to take place for those two reasons alone, although theoretically, it is possible to go ahead and actually change the constitution.
Is there any way, Dr. Laskiewicz, that Russia would agree a peace deal that leaves Ukraine sovereign, independent, and prosperous, as the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has suggested?
Actually, as to the prosperity part, Russia has nothing against that. I mean, Russia has actually been buying out nations' foreign debts, which was actually well received by those countries. And so therefore, it is not that Russia is against prosperity. It's about the independence. It depends what you push it. But the key point about it is this. Is Ukraine going to become a part of NATO and the UE, in which case Russia feels threatened, or is it to be independent of both, which will be another matter altogether? However, the problem is that Ukraine can always go back on its accord and then join the EU and NATO. That is always possible, of course. But more to the point, whether Russia would be willing to take such a risk is dubious. However, it is the last point, which is coming to, which is, of course, the worst. Is Ukraine going to be left whole? And the answer is no. Russia wants that territory. And basically, here comes the sticking point, because Ukraine doesn't want to give it up. So we're back to where we were in the last exchange.
Meanwhile, of course, Russia is, let me say, attritionally gaining ground on the battlefield. It is claiming to have taken control of 2 towns in the east of Ukraine, including Petrovsk, which is a key strategic sort of logistics town, although Ukraine has contradicted that claim. But if Russia has the upper hand on the battlefield, surely it would take a better deal from Moscow's perspective to bring the conflict to an end.
The last point is quite correct, but before we go on to that, just quickly, Pokrovsk, the two sentences are not actually contradictory. Russia does have the center of Pokrovsk, as far as I can tell, hence the flag, and has most of Pokrovsk, in which case it can be said to have captured the town. However, not fully, because Ukraine is holding on to parts of northern Pokrovsk, and therefore a small proportion of it is still in Ukrainian hands, but the majority is not. That would explain that the two sentences actually by Russian Ukraine do actually fit. More importantly, and this is the point, if they can finish off Pokrovsk, from Russia's point of view, it will have an advantage, and therefore they will indeed be in a strong position to state they want the whole of the Ukrainian territory de jure, as they wanted in the original points that Putin agreed with Trump before. So yes, it does put Russia into a stronger position, and simply underlines the fact that President Putin is unlikely to back down. Moreover, please note, a dictator, which is what President Putin is, cannot really back down. He can't really submit or surrender. That's the way to be thrown out of power. So it's very difficult for Russia to back down in any case for all these reasons.
Very, very interesting assessment from you there, Dr. Laskiewicz. You mentioned President Trump. He told reporters there's a good chance he can make a deal with Russia because, according to him, he believes Mr. Putin wants to stop people being killed as much as the US does. I mean, do you share President Trump's optimism at all? Is there perhaps some backroom deal that we're not aware of?
Well, the answer is quite possibly there is a backroom deal, because the USA has always got the option of a unilateral deal with Russia, I mean, this is on the cards. And therefore, he has already made it clear before to Zelensky, but then back down, that either Zelensky agrees or he cuts off all aid to Ukraine. And this is still sotto voce, perhaps, but it's still there. The threat is still there. And therefore, yes, as long as President Putin and President Trump can agree, and President Trump feels the treaty is sellable to everybody else, I mean his own supporters above all, the MAGA ones, then it could go ahead. And what Zelensky thinks or doesn't think will be of a lesser importance, as in fact what Europe thinks or does not think is of lesser importance. So therefore, the answer is yes, there is an opportunity for USA and Russia to strike a deal which will leave Ukraine either having to accept it or bereft of American aid. And for this reason, he's optimistic. Where I think he's in the land of the cloud cuckoo land is by saying that President Putin wants the killing to stop. To be quite accurate, President Putin wants to win the war. Hence, in that sense, he wants the killing to stop. But I cannot see President Putin backing down from a few more killings in order not to win the war. Please remember, he is a KGB officer, and the KGB have in their time themselves got through quite a few bodies.
Indeed, I suspect a lot of people would agree with your assessment there. And you mentioned Europe, of course, and rather dismissively, which is pretty much the same point that Vladimir Putin made earlier this today. So essentially, Europe is out of the equation, is it?
Europe is out of the primary equation, which is USA-Russia. It's even only a tenuous place in the secondary one, including Ukraine. What is more interesting from my point of view is how President Putin phrased it. I assert the war will continue for very obvious reason that President Putin, if he wins, is on a roll, and he cannot lose, so he will, I think, sooner or later attack Europe, because he's constantly saying Europe is threatening Russia and Russia is ready for war. It's as if he were laying out the PR ground, the propaganda ground, to be more accurate, for a subsequent attack, which will be, of course, on Poland. So therefore, this is the worrying feature. He's not entirely ignoring Europe, he's threatening Europe. That's the slight difference. But he's certainly ignoring it in the first sense of that it plays no part in his thinking together with America, as indeed it doesn't do for America, to be honest. And all this talk of Europe rearming 2030, there might be a Russian invasion before 2030. So the whole business of Europe finally getting together and rearming by 2030 is absolutely irrelevant.
I'm still looking at your books as reference points as these things continue to evolve. Dr. Laskiewicz, thank you ever so much for that very lucid perspective. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the author and international affairs analyst who was talking to me on the line there from London.